Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Licensed mental health professionals, we warmly invite you to join our Spring 2026 NARM Therapist Training, a live online immersion into the transformative power of the NeuroAffective Relational Model. This advanced clinical training is designed specifically for those seeking to deepen their expertise in healing complex trauma while offering the accessibility of an online format. From January to August 2026, you'll be part of a supportive virtual community of learners integrating mindfulness and clinical expertise. Through 4 comprehensive modules, you'll gain specialized trauma-informed knowledge and skills to confidently and compassionately address the impacts of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. Together, we'll explore how to support the resolution of attachment, developmental, relational, cultural, and intergenerational trauma using a neurobiologically informed approach that promotes post-traumatic growth. Embodying professional and personal growth, you'll become a catalyst for transformation in your practice and community. Enrollment is now open for licensed psychotherapists, counselors, social workers, psychologists, and other mental health professionals, as well as graduate trainees and interns working toward licensure. Visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com to learn more and secure your spot in this online training opportunity. And now for our interview. Dr. Laura Anderson is a therapist, trauma resolution and recovery coach, writer, educator, and creator who specializes in complex trauma with a focus on domestic violence, sexualized violence, and religious trauma. Laura works in private practice and is the founder and director of the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. In 2019, Laura also co-founded the Religious Trauma Institute. Laura's first book, When Religion Hurts You, Healing from Religious Trauma and the Impact of High Control Religion, was released in October of 2023. She lives with her dog, Phoebe, in Nashville, Tennessee. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Laura Anderson. All right, today I have with us Dr. Laura Anderson. Laura, welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Hi, it's so good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a delight to have you. I'm really excited to have this conversation. And I'd love to start by just asking you, what is it that you would like our listeners to come away from our conversation with today?
Yeah, it might sound a little cliche, but I would love for listeners to come away recognizing that religious trauma is trauma. And I think we'll probably get into like unpacking what I'm actually meaning by that. But yeah, just that religious trauma, how it functions in the body, how we resolve it, and the way we recover is very similar to how we recover from other trauma. So that's what I hope.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
That's a great segue kind of into where I was curious how you hold that term religious trauma. Like, what does that mean to you?
Yeah. Whenever anybody asks me what is religious trauma, the first thing that I say is that, we have to understand what trauma is first. And I do have a definition of religious trauma that I'll share in a moment. But I think that understanding what trauma is what actually helps us understand what religious trauma is. And I know that in the field of, traumatology, there's all these differing non-succinct definitions of what trauma is. But I usually say trauma is anything that is too much, too fast, too soon, or happens for too long that overwhelms our ability to cope and come back to a place of safety. And that's also recognizing then that trauma is not necessarily the thing that happens to you, but the way that your body and nervous system responds to the thing that happens to you. So when we look at that from a religious lens, we would say, oh, it is anything that is too much, too fast, too soon, or happens too long in religious context, whether that's beliefs or practices, doctrines, relationships, environments, experiences that are overwhelming to our nervous systems, our ability to cope and come back to a place of safety. Now, I'm sure we'll get into this more, but I do think that religious trauma fits pretty neatly under the umbrella of complex trauma when we look at different facets of it and the totality of how somebody is impacted. But for now, we can leave the religious trauma definition at that. And then I also wanted to share, I co-founded the Religious Trauma Institute with another colleague of mine, and the two of us, as well as the founders of the Reclamation Collective, did come up with a definition that we use for religious trauma, and I'll just read it. And this is kind of, I would consider it a working definition. It is open for, change or, to refine it however needed to. But the way that we've defined it is a person's reaction to religious beliefs, practices, or structures that is overwhelming or disruptive. It can have lasting negative effects on a person's physical, mental, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And so that's kind of, I guess, our working definition, but I think you can see that also really fits well under the definition of trauma that I gave just in a religious context.
Yeah. What landed for me and what I really appreciate about the way you're holding this is like it leaves so much space for people having different experiences.
Yes.
And that for, something that might be too fast, too much, too soon, all of those things for one person may not be the same for another person. And I know I've seen, like conversations, dialogue online and in other spaces where people are like, but that wasn't too much for me, so that's not trauma. Right. And you're holding this really beautiful, just the way you shape that, it like leaves all this spaciousness for people to have different experiences.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I think that is important because, there's many clients that I work with, many friends and colleagues that I have where we go, okay, I experienced it this way, or the result was this for me, but my sibling who grew up in the same home with the same teachings, went to the same church, sat next to me as I was, with them, they're walking away with no symptoms, no risk, no overwhelm, or maybe very different ones. And so it's not to over validate or invalidate. It's just this recognition that how our body responds to that overwhelm is unique to the individual.
Yes. And in fact, I've even heard, if I can just piggyback on that, like some people that say, oh no, that was really supportive for me. That wasn't traumatic. Right. I really enjoyed that. I really liked that. So again, you're just holding all this spaciousness for how everyone is unique and how they take these things in.
Very much so. Yeah.
Yeah. So where would you like to begin in terms of like, there's exploration, because I want to hear about you. I want to hear about how you came to this work. Like there's so much we could talk about. What feels right for you in terms of where we start?
Yeah, I mean, I'm usually asked the question why religious trauma? How'd you get into this? And I think it is important because, my personal experiences is what influences and motivates my professional work. I think that's true for a lot of clinicians. When you see a clinician that is specializing in a certain area, the likelihood that that's of personal interest to them because they've experienced it or know somebody else very close to them who has is pretty high. And I certainly don't think that in order to work with religious trauma as a clinician or practitioner that you have to have experienced this. But I do find that if you have your own lived experience, there's something there that helps in the joining process and ease and validation and connection because the client isn't having to convince you that it was that bad or that, it wasn't just a quote unquote bad church experience or people being sinners, right? But that there really was harm and overwhelm that happened to them. And so that can feel very helpful for the client. So that is part of my story is that I grew up in all of this as well. I was a full-time camp kid. My dad was the director at an evangelical Christian camp where we lived on site. So it was meant to be a bubble. It was meant to be isolating from the world. It was meant to be a place that you would go and have a break from the external influences so that you could be essentially indoctrinated into whatever it was that was being taught, whether that was the doctrine and beliefs, whether it was dress codes or how relationships were supposed to go, how you're supposed to act in the world with non-believers so that you can bring them into the fold. And so, it very much was a bubble from the time that we moved there, which I was in late elementary all the way through high school. There was a period of many years, really until my senior year of high school, where I didn't see really anybody outside of the camp people for at least 3.5 months every year because, as you can imagine, most camps aren't like in a metropolis area. They're out,
Yeah.
right? And so
Yeah.
we were 30 minutes away from school, from other people. We were hours away from the rest of our family. And I don't want to, the experience wasn't totally bad. I mean, like every kid wants to grow up on a lake with a ropes course in their backyard and a horse corral across the street. That is what I had, you know? And so and now as an adult, I appreciate that piece of it
That
even
aspect,
more.
yeah.
But you have to take it in balance with also like, yes, those were really wonderful things. And also what that set us up for and what the purpose of that was. I also grew up in the 90s, which is very much where we see purity culture, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but this high emphasis on abstinence, as well as very specific ways of living out your relationships, your sexuality. It really encompassed everything. You know, True Love Waits hit the nation. It went beyond churches in 1994. I mean, I am pretty sure that my True Love Waits card was nailed into the Capitol Mall, you know, along with everybody else's, making this pledge that I would remain a virgin until I was married. I was a late bloomer adolescence wise, and I was like, I don't even know what virginity is, and boys have cooties. Like that's how I was, but yet I was making this huge promise that I had no idea what the ramifications of that would be. And so it's things like that that are all kind of compounding on top of each other. Because of that, because of both the religion I grew up in as well as purity culture, when I graduated from high school, I was really conflicted. I wanted to go on to school. I wanted to get a degree to go off and live, you know, see what the world had to offer. I've always had this mindset that there's something bigger out there. But I was also then faced with this ideal that as a woman, my job was going to be to get married and to have kids and to raise them in the same religious system. And that would be the pinnacle of my existence. And that's not to knock mothers or stay-at-home mothers. It's just that was really the only choice that was championed. And when you're 17 years old and that's not really a choice, right? To say like, here's where all your support and all the financial resources and all of everything is going to be here. Or, you know, I'm going to have nothing on the outside world, which is terrifying. So I chose to stay, quote unquote, at home. I went to a community college. I got deeply involved in our church. I was eventually hired on to work there full time in ministry. And that's where I would say I started to experience what I now consider very overt acts of spiritual abuse. I would say these dynamics of high control were always at play and always very present, but it's where I was in contact with other ministry leaders and really experiencing it overtly done to me, whether that was through gaslighting, manipulation, accusations, being screamed at, you know, being surveilled and very, you know, having to be very hyper vigilant all the time. And, so I worked in that for years, and eventually I quit because of some very overt spiritual abuse. I didn't have the language for it at the time, but looking back, I can very much see that. So I worked there for several years. I ended up quitting. And my thought for quitting was I'm going to go back to school because I realized that as a woman, I had very few options available to me outside of a very specific box. And if I wanted to work anywhere outside of my community, I had to have like a marketable skill. And so that did lead me back to going back to school for my master's degree, where I got my marriage and family therapy degree. And literally, like as soon as I got that degree, I left everything behind. Because until that point, I felt like I was fully dependent on that community, whether it was for my literal work livelihood, my community, my connection, my sense of well-being, my identity. And to leave all of that without something to fall back on was too much. So you can see where we're starting to get these dynamics of power and control at play. But when I all of a sudden had this marketable skill as a marriage and family therapist, I thought I can move anywhere. And I jumped at the first opportunity, which was, you know, here to Nashville, where I'm still at. You know, it's been about 15 years or so. So yeah, I did that. I was asking questions of my faith at the time, but when you're in a system like that, you can only go so far because for survival's sake, right? You get to this place of cognitive dissonance where you're going, if I go down this path of continuing to ask questions, there's going to be some negative consequences to this. And I, for a long time, was not ready to face the possibility of what those consequences might be. But when I got to a space where I was able to take care of myself, where I was able to develop friendships and relationships outside of that system, I also then had freedom to start asking some of these questions. And so I did. I kind of call it like, like you're flipping over stones and just kind of going and going and going, which is really, really helpful for me. At the time, I was also in a relationship that I didn't call it this at the time, but now I know was a domestically violent relationship. And those things were very much in tandem for me in terms of like starting to understand dynamics of power and control. As I was getting out of that relationship, I couldn't also not see the similarities of the system that I had come out of. I was working with domestically violent victims of domestically violent relationships at the time, which was just kind of this weird, like, oh my gosh, what in the world is happening? So I could see, I was like in it on all facets. And so all of a sudden it just kind of started unraveling. And I really had to kind of dive headfirst even more into this healing process. Of course, it was back at a time where, clinically speaking, we didn't really recognize trauma for what it is, how we recognize it today. So I had to go through many different practitioners, doctors, therapists, spend tens of thousands of dollars on all these alternative treatments, trying to figure out what was going on with me when, in reality, it's like, well, it was trauma, So it was really my own healing from that system and what happened there that really kind of put me in this trajectory of having to figure out like what is going on with me. And, I was like introduced to Peter Levine's work back in 2010 or something like that. I had all of his books on my shelf, but I hadn't read them, right? I thought, oh, they look good, but I hadn't read them. And finally one day I was like, I'm going to just crack this open and see. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is what it is. It's trauma. But that was so helpful because I was, going through my own process and working with a somatic experiencing practitioner and was able to really see so much more progress. And then that directly translated to my client work. Being in the South, the first thing they ask you after what's your name is what church do you go to? It is baked into the culture here. And so I would have people then coming into my office almost like secretly saying like, hey, these are the things that are happening to me. I'm in Hobby Lobby and I'm getting super duper triggered. Or, my parents are asking me why I'm not going to church and I don't know what to say, but they're very angry. And so it was just this weird kind of natural interweaving of my own personal journey and then what my clients were dealing with. And sometimes I felt like I was one day ahead of them in terms of the healing journey. And I was just like, oh, I hope they don't figure this out yet because I've only known it for one day too. So
I appreciate you naming that parallel process because I'm sure a lot of clinicians out there are resonating. Sometimes we feel a half a step in front. Yeah,
exactly. And so we, what I started to see is that people, were coming out of these religions, they're having these embodied responses. And it wasn't just this solution of become an atheist or reject all of that. It was still going hey, I may not believe this stuff, but I'm having physiological responses to things that are happening, to ways that I'm trying to live differently. And my body is, putting up all these signs of resistance or, shutting down or things like that. So my work has always been then to not vilify religion or to try to get people to become atheists as a way from healing from a high control religion, but rather to say we need to look at the person's body, the person's physiology, and start to understand how trauma is living inside of them and then resolve it the same way we would with any other trauma.
That's right. There's some language that you're using that I'm finding really helpful. And I just want to highlight. One of the words I've heard you say a few times now is harm. And I think that is a nice, because a lot of clients will not say I have trauma or that, it wasn't really religious trauma or it wasn't abuse. I don't want to put it in that box. And so I just like the way you're languaging it because I think that that's a nice way for a lot of clients to kind of acknowledge and self-validate. Yeah, at the very least it was harmful. And even if it wasn't harmful to my brother or my sister, Their experience was different. I can acknowledge this was harmful to me. And again, it just leaves all that spaciousness for them to have their unique experience. So I wanted to highlight that because I've heard you use that word a few times. The other piece I don't know, I'm just curious about, and I wonder if others are too, is this idea of like you had all of Peter Levine's books on your shelf. Like they were just waiting for you to be ready. There's something in there. I feel like there's a story there. And I don't know if there's anything to share around like what kind of brought you to that place. Because that's a bit of a jump, really, to have the books on your shelf and be like, I'm ready to read them. I'm ready to actually really learn what is happening for me. And I know you'd already been doing work and you said you had been doing some somatic work, but can you talk about that a little bit? Is there anything there?
Yeah. So, I had been working. One thing about me is like, if I'm in, I'm in. Like, it's like my hyperfixation, it's like my hobby, right? This is what I'm going to do, is this healing stuff. And I could not deny the physical and psychological symptoms that I had. And they started almost immediately after I kicked my domestically violent partner out of our home. It was like I had a weekend of freedom. And then all of a sudden it was like everything started to kind of unravel. Which I think that's extremely common now. Like, right when our bodies go, oh, I'm finally safe. There's that we're not having to brace anymore. And all of a sudden, everything that's been going on underneath is able to then start expressing itself. And it did. My goodness, did it ever. But it was very confusing for doctors. It was very confusing for therapists that I was going to. And I wasn't being dishonest in my stories. I was telling them, hey, here's what's happened. But they weren't able to kind of piece it together in the way that somebody might be able to now. And that's a huge, that was, almost 15 years ago. So we've come a long way in 15 years clinically.
Yes.
To like, if somebody walked into my office today with that, I would immediately be able to say
you
trauma.
would.
Yeah.
You would. But I just want to say there's probably a lot who, maybe aren't. So this is really useful, I think, for you to just be sharing in case there's anyone that isn't as familiar with this, like acknowledging this unraveling that you're talking about sometimes comes after the exit. Like when we think, oh, well, they should be doing better now. You might think that. You might go to that place of like, well, now why is all this coming up? Why are all these symptoms coming up now? And so for you to name, that isn't that uncommon. In fact, that's kind of the process of how a lot. So for any maybe newbie clinicians out there, just acknowledging, like recognizing this might be part of the pattern. So I just wanted to highlight that again. I think that's really important.
One of the things I think, that is important. So when we're in states of overwhelm and chaos, the phrase that I use a lot is we're bracing, right? And if you think about that posture in your body when you're bracing, I'm even doing it now. There's a tightness, my shoulders are raised, my arms are in. There's not a lot of flexibility that I have for movement. So when you think about like how your body stores things, it is tight, right? You are like in survival. So I have access to like my survival, like my heart can beat and whatever, but there's not a lot of flexibility to move around in there. Right. When I go, okay, I'm in a space of safety, I can relax a little bit. All of a sudden, like, it's great. I can move around, but so can everything else, right? And just like we might look at like a physical trauma, if there's something that has impaled us, the reason we don't just pull it out is because we don't know how organs have shifted and everything. We wait until we can get to the doctor's office, right? And that's the same way that trauma works, right? It's like something's kind of wounded us, injured us, impaled us. And so when we kind of get back to this place of safety, it's like pulling that thing out, and all of a sudden everything is reorganizing. Everything that has been mobilized to keep you safe is now kind of like being able to relax a little bit. And that's where we start to see then the symptoms, whether it's, mental health, physical health, everything in between.
You're naming something so important, and I don't have the language for it. And so I'm just going to, like, you're the expert. Let's hear a little bit about this. I'm seeing this sometimes, like you said, and I love that visual that you gave. It's like, if we're being impaled with something, we wait. We don't just go pulling it out, because there could be kind of more trauma done if we move too fast, too quick in that way, in sort of like pulling it out. And there's something there that you're speaking to that I think is really valuable for clinicians, especially. Like, we don't want to just, we want to support our client in taking a pace that allows that work to not be as traumatic.
Yes.
You can speak to
Yes.
it. I'll let you talk about that a little bit more, but I think that's really important to highlight.
Yeah. So in my own healing journey, I had done several years of therapy and working with alternative medicine practitioners, doctors, everything in between. That work was not for nothing, truly. I learned some really wonderful things about myself. I started to learn boundaries. I started to learn all of this stuff so that by the time that I got to like, oh, this is what's happening. Here's Peter's book. It's telling me, it's like reading my life, essentially. I was ready, kind of like emotionally, mentally, physically. There was like a relaxing in my body, and I already had enough skills and kind of coping mechanisms that I knew that I already had access to that made being able to kind of dive into it a little bit more accessible. But I don't know that that's the case for everybody. We talked about trauma being the result of anything that's too much, too fast, too soon, or happens for too long. And you'll notice we're not saying too much of a negative thing, too much of a harmful thing. It could be anything. That's the craziness of the subjectivity of trauma, is that it is so subjective to every person, but also to every experience. And so even, like cannonballing into trauma work can be extremely overwhelming. And so we have to go in a more titrated way. There are clients that I have worked with where they've worked with clinicians who are very well intended and who very much wanted healing for their clients, but they essentially like threw them into a pool that they didn't know how to swim in, and just kind of like opening up that box of trauma, letting everything come out. And that was too much, too fast, too soon, because their systems didn't know how to handle that and didn't have the skills to organize that. And so then they've come to me, not only having experienced all this stuff in their past, but then feeling extremely overwhelmed and even more hesitant to get into it with me because of then what happened in that setting. And again, it wasn't like a therapist acting in like a malpractice way. They were acting with the best of intent. They were truly trying not to do any harm, but because they didn't have the skills to know how to tiptoe into it in a very titrated way, the client ends up being more overwhelmed. And so I think that's just for clinicians, like, yes, your instincts are probably right, but make sure you have the skills to back them up so that we can help our clients in a way that's actually meaningful and effective.
Yes. Thank you. And can I just add, sometimes the clients are asking for that. Sometimes they're like, I want to dive in. I want to, and there's all this like energy around kind of uprooting the trauma and getting rid of it. And so that can be a process in of itself of just like being with the client and saying, let's take this slow. So anyway, I appreciate how you're naming that.
Yeah. I do. I'm thinking of a couple of clients right now where they're like, well, let's just dive in. And I have some specific skills that I've been able to learn. And so I know how to quote unquote, let them dive in a way that's still safe, but very, very contained. And so sometimes I will follow their lead into that. And I typically know exactly what's going to happen, but I also know how to get them out of that. And so I'll let them dive in a little bit and they'll go, oh my gosh, this is too much. And I'll say, okay, I needed you to be able to experience just that the edge of the too muchness, right? Yeah. So that maybe you can be bought in a little bit more to this like slower way. And I don't make many promises, but I do promise, like, if you will commit to going slower right now, you will eventually be able to go faster. And that theory has not been proven wrong yet.
I love it.
But I think it's so important to know that when we are healing anything, but especially when we're looking at trauma, we cannot heal it the same way that it happened to us. So if it was too much, too fast, too soon, to do healing too much, too fast, too soon, we're going to get the same results. We can't just assume that it's going to be better because it's quote unquote good instead of bad. Very slow is my motto.
I can't remember if this was a phrase in your book, which we'll talk about in a minute, I'm sure. But there was something that jumped out at me in your work, and it was taking the time and the effort needed to live in healing bodies. And that phrase really landed for me. Can you speak? I mean, that's kind of like exactly what you've just been talking about. Can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think in other eras of therapy, there was kind of this idea of you go to therapy, you do the work, and you are healed, and you go on and you live your life. And I think that is, again, with the best of intents, because, yeah, that's why are we doing what we're doing, right? We're doing this so that we can help people live a more full and whole life. But I think what is maybe sets people up to fail a little bit in that way of thinking is like there is then this end goal, this point that you get to where you're good, you're done, you're healed, and that's that. But what happens then if we're trying to reach this goal and we say, okay, I've gotten there, and then I'm, say, triggered, a day later, a week later, a month later, all of a sudden it's like, oh no, I didn't heal. I didn't do what I was supposed to. There's a lot of shame. All of a sudden now I'm back dependent on therapy again to get me to this point of like being healed again. And I think that it also is very, very prescriptive. It doesn't really trust the body and the body's process. It's saying, okay, I think here's the point that I have to get to. And so if I don't get to that point, then nothing else matters. And that was my story as well. I mentioned like I had a lot of physical symptoms. Like one of them was like I had a very significant unexplained weight gain. And, we know now why the body will kind of pack on weight or hold weight or things like that. And so my thought is if I can just lose the weight, then that's going to mean that I'm healed. Well, it turns out like, no, that wasn't it, right? There was a reason that weight existed, but also there was so many other things that were happening that needed to be attended to before we could ever address kind of this external, shell of what was, indicating what had happened. And so if my, gauge of healing was just that I needed to be a certain size on the scale, then nothing else was going to matter. And I was also missing the way that I was healing. I was missing the way of the changes that were happening. And so this is the work that I did in my doctoral research. I was looking at what does it mean or what does it look like to live after trauma. And I was still kind of in that old mindset in my doctoral dissertation chair was like, hey, I think you might be looking at healing with too limited of a scope. What if you started expanding it? And I went back to all the libraries and there was nothing talking about healing as like anything other than a fixed point or this idea of post-traumatic growth, which is like, okay, this bad thing happened to you, but we're going to find the ways to grow out of it. And so for months, I was like looking different terms, different searches, different everything. And I finally found like one article. And it was this like, yeah, if we look at it as more of this open process that is just constantly happening, it's not getting to this fixed point, then not only do we have the flexibility to go where our bodies need to go, but it means then that every moment can be a healing moment. And it means that we're also not putting off living our lives, right? So many people will say, once I get to this point and I'm healed, then I can live, right? And that's not to say that sometimes we don't need to like adjust all of our energy and resources to like their therapy work that we're doing. Sometimes we do need to do that. But more often than not, like we need to just live in the process of all of this. Healing is a living, ongoing process. The whole point of this is so that we can live, right? We don't have to necessarily wait to get to a certain point and then I can live. And so it felt really important to be able to frame it in that way too. If healing then is a living process, then we go, oh, hey, you know what? I was triggered here. And being triggered doesn't mean that I'm now having to go back to therapy. It means that, oh, I'm noticing that I'm triggered. I have different access to coping skills. I can work myself through it. It doesn't put me in the bed for 2 weeks anymore. Like that's a really big deal. And we need to celebrate that. That is what gives us the motivation to continue living and healing.
Beautiful. There's so many things that you're saying. Like my brain is, again, I'm just getting really curious. I want to ask all these questions, but I want to highlight there's some things you're saying that really align with the NARM model that many of our listeners will be familiar with. But this piece around, how did you say it? I'm trying to think of your words again, but like we might have a client coming in with this sort of a superficial goal. Like, I think that my weight is because all of my trauma. So this kind of if I can just get from point A to point B, then I'll be fixed kind of idea. And holding this really spacious, again, just like a open, like, let's get curious about that. And coming down to this deeper place that you're inviting, instead of this kind of goal oriented, okay, that's what you want to do, then we'll do that, and inviting something deeper. I'm not quite sure the words that I'm wanting to use there, but I just appreciate what you're inviting there.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I always say, like, as a clinician, like, I am not the expert of somebody's life, but I do have some expertise in skills and holding the structure for that space, right? And that's part of why people come to see me, is because they're going, something that I'm doing isn't working. Can you help? Right? And what I love about, like, somatic work is that, your body is the tool of healing. And so you have everything there. I can help you develop some skills, but you technically don't need me, to go and do a grounding skill, to, tune into your body. Like, I can help point you in that direction, but ultimately it's you. And so I try to start that from the very beginning, even when they're like, all right, we got to work on this really annoying symptom. I'll go there a little bit, and I might then just invite them with curiosity to say, like, hey, here's what I've noticed. Could we just check this out and see what would happen? Because it always gives them permission to be like, no, we don't have to. And sometimes, like, I was the same way, where it was like, no, we got to work on this one issue. This is the issue. But usually that's just a protective part of us that is trying to kind of, like, bolster their strength a bit so that we don't get to the more tender parts. So I get that. I have so much empathy and consideration and compassion for that.
And what I love too is, like, someone who's working through religious trauma, they didn't have a voice to be able to say no.
Yes.
And so for them to even be able to exercise in communicating to you, and that you're creating a space that they feel safe enough to say that right there is an intervention. So I'm just loving, how you're holding all of this. Very cool.
Yeah. Thank you.
Very cool. So again, there's so much more I want to ask, and I'm mindful of the time. So I'm wondering, what else are you hoping our listeners will all this work that you've done and all the learning, because like you said, the field has come so far in the last decade, in the last 15 years. What else would you hope our listeners would understand that maybe isn't, maybe it isn't out there in the world, maybe it's not super predominant, but is there anything that you can share, maybe personally too?
Yeah. Well, one of the things you mentioned earlier was, the use of words like harm and things like that, because maybe people don't identify with the words, like abuse or trauma or things like that. And so I, first of all, want to just validate, I think that, colloquially, when people say abuse, we have a very specific idea of what that would be. When somebody says spiritual or religious abuse, they immediately think of, like, clergy sexual abuse, which of course is spiritual abuse, right? But it's not limited to just that. And I think that, words matter. And especially when we're talking about overwhelming experiences, when our language centers are turned off in our brains to be able to organize what it is that happened to us, I think that's, like, being able to help clients organize what is it that happened to them can be really helpful. And so to that end, that's, why I talk about things in the way that I do. But another term that some of my colleagues and I have come up with that we've found to be something that really resonates with people is the term adverse religious experience, or ARE. And it's obviously very, like, you could be like, oh, is that adverse childhood experience? Kind of, like, we took some of the tenets from that. But what we found was that people really were very resistant to using the term spiritual abuse to describe what it was that they had experienced, because of the cultural definitions and expectations of that. And so we came up with adverse religious experiences. I'll read the definition that we came up with, and then I'll explain it. And again, this is a working definition, but we said an adverse religious experience is any experience of a religious belief, practice, or structure that undermines an individual's sense of safety or autonomy, and or negatively impacts their physical, social, emotional, relational, or psychological well-being. And this term, I think in part the reason this term has taken off and really connected with people is, again, that subjectivity. So because something was adverse for me doesn't necessarily mean that it was adverse for you. But it also is like this kind of casts this like wider net to be like, yeah, maybe I don't consider the teaching of this doctrine or this belief system as abusive, but I can definitely say that there was some adverse effects that it had on me, that there was some harmful effects that it had on me. And that seems to like land in somebody's body in a way that they're able to say, yeah, I've experienced many AREs. We have kind of a running hypothesis that, the more AREs somebody has, the greater the likelihood that it would result in religious trauma. But that doesn't have to be that either. As we know, like one ARE or one experience could result in trauma, where 100 AREs may not result in trauma. So again, there's a subjectivity there that is open for people to have their own experiences. But it also then gives people some language. Now, of course, this isn't like you're not going to find AREs in the DSM or, anything like that. But you can Google it now and many things will come up about it. People are using the term. There is research being done to test out the hypothesis and to expand what that might mean. Unlike the ACE study, we don't have like 10 categories of AREs. We would say if it was adverse to you, it was an adverse experience to you. Like that's just kind of bottom line. So yeah, I like talking about that too. And it does play into kind of what we mentioned at the very beginning is religious trauma really falling under that umbrella of complex trauma because of the totality of it, because there are so many things that may have happened to somebody that were consistent and persistent and inescapable, that it really shifts the baseline of their identity. Their autonomy is taken away. And then healing from that is a whole multidimensional complex process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, I'm just really appreciating the spaciousness that these concepts, the way you're talking about it, leaves for folks, because I know I've talked to many people who they're not actually, well, let me backtrack a little bit. Something that I think you've done in your book and in your work is rather than really like centering the effects of AREs, you're centering the effects of AREs rather than like telling people to leave religion, which I think a lot of deconstruction literature that's out there, that's kind of the end goal is like telling people to leave religion. And for folks that have that religion has provided a structure, like I was talking to someone just the other day, they're like, listen, I was in a rough crowd in high school. A lot of the people I knew were either in supermax prison now or they're not living. And religion really kept me safe from a lot of those things. Like it kind of pulled me in, it like reined me in. And they experience religion in that way. And so what I feel like this language that you're using provides is for folks that are finding safety in religion or finding, something that nourishes them spiritually, and they might be able to recognize these adverse religious experiences. These folks can bring that into their religion experience and hopefully help shift cultures or shift the way things are done to provide a healthier space for those who are wanting to stay in. That's just something that really struck me as I was going through your work is like, again, you're just providing space for nuance and for folks to have a different religious experience. And that if they want to stay in, like hopefully they're creating a healthier experience for themselves. Does that land for you?
Yeah.
I'm hoping my words are making sense.
It does. And I'm so glad that you picked up on it because that truly is my hope. One of the things I've been asked before, like, why don't you come out harder and say like, religion is or is not this or that or whatever. And in part because like, I just really don't think that's my job to do that. Like it's not, and it's none of my business to do that. It's not my business what you decide for you. But I think that if I were to do that, if anybody were to do that, we are quickly becoming just as fundamentalist, just kind of with a different message. And that's something that I really want to guard against, not only in my own personal life, but the way that I work with clients. We came out of these systems that were extremely controlling and extreme, had extreme influence on every area of our lives. And it is the human tendency then to look for someone else to fill that spot because our nervous systems like certainty, or at least the illusion of it. Right. And so I don't want to be another person that like recreates the dynamic that they've come out of. Because again, we can't heal from that high control dynamic with another high control dynamic.
Right.
And even though our nervous systems might be attuned to finding that because that's what we are used to, healing is really giving yourself back the choice and being able to kind of navigate things in a different way. And so, so then really it's none of my business where somebody decides to land or whatever. And they should be able to decide that for themselves. So I know for myself and the practitioners that I work alongside, our goal is never to get somebody to a specific point spiritually or religiously to get them to go back or to a different church or to become an atheist. It is totally up to the client of what is going to be best for them. Now, we might encourage them to kind of be wary of other high control systems, but it's not because I'm trying to control them. It's because we're helping them realize like, oh, this is what you've said has been really harmful for you. What do we need to do so that we're not recreating these dynamics in other relationships and systems you're a part of?
Beautiful. I love that. And again, you're just honoring the agency of the client.
Yes.
I don't know the word it's like, it feels like it's counteracting exactly what they've already experienced. And you're inviting them to really engage with their agency, which is a really foundational principle in the NARM model. So I know a lot of folks are going to be nodding their heads and excited about how you're talking about this.
Yes.
Very
a
cool.
fun little fact is the practice that I own, or the company that I own, Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, there is some required readings that all of the practitioners have to do, and the NARM book is one of them.
Oh, fantastic. I love it. That's so great.
Yes. And because, obviously like we're wanting to look at trauma in a more holistic way. We're understanding how religious trauma and complex trauma really do fit like extremely well together. And so to that end, there's some kind of they're not universal truths, I guess. Like, I guess maybe not everybody has to work on this, but typically speaking, we have these themes that we're really working through. And we see that to be very relevant with religious trauma clients or, clients coming out of cults, fundamentalism, and other high control groups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I feel like we have limited time. And again, there's like 20 questions I want to ask you. So I'll just redirect back to you. What else are you wanting to make sure that we're coming away with? Because this is such an important topic.
Yeah, I know I've mentioned a couple of times religious trauma being under that umbrella of complex trauma. And I think it's worth noting why that is. When we look at complex trauma or why something might result in like CPTSD, we're looking at, this consistent, persistent threat and overwhelm that is inescapable. That's, and we see that in domestically violent situations, kidnapping, terrorism, systems of oppression, these long-standing experiences where there's really no out, that analogy of like death by 1,000 paper cuts. And I think that is true in high control religions too. And again, there's a lot of subjectivity there, right? Because everybody can be impacted in a very different way. But for those people who were deeply impacted and deeply harmed, I think we're looking more at complex trauma than single incident or shock trauma. Now, of course, that can happen, right? There can be these very overwhelming singular experiences where somebody says there was a before and then this experience happened and then, then there was the after, right? But in a lot of cases, people aren't being able to say, okay, it was this one experience that shifted everything for me. Most of the time they're saying, well, it was this teaching and it was this time that my parents told me this. And it was this time where, I was 5 years old and taught about eternal conscious torment and absolutely terrified. And I was told that was actually a gift, right? Like these sorts of things that are eroding somebody's individuality, their autonomy, their sense of self, their sense of safety. And in a lot of cases, unfortunately, within high control religion, we see a lot of abusive practices, but they're being told to somebody as, or considered to be loving and caring and compassionate. And so there really is this multidimensional effect that it has on a person. And so when they're coming out of that, especially if they have been born into it or grown up the majority of their life, when they come out of it, similar to the child who's come out of a very abusive, neglectful home, we're looking at like, having to start at, square one. Who am
Right.
I? Who am I without all of this, right? I'm having to figure that out. I'm having to relearn how to navigate the world. In some cases, I'm having to learn very basic, skills for living because everything was tied up into that group.
Right.
Maybe I don't have a professional identity outside of that group. Maybe I have zero community or connection outside of that group. Maybe there are still, unfortunately, there are some high control groups that, cause a lot of pain and punishment, consequence, and retribution for people who leave. So maybe we're dealing with that as well. We're dealing with somebody who's had to live with very specific cognitive dissonances and ways of thinking about themselves in the world in order to survive.
Yes.
And so, like, even just in that description, it's extremely complex. So I always encourage practitioners, if they can view it in that way, that can then help the way that we're working with our clients to navigate this. And it isn't about, resolving every single experience that has happened. It's about that integration piece, right? It's about
Right.
learning how to find safety internally, learning how to navigate different triggers with different coping skills, and how to integrate the past into our present so that it's not taking over. And so
Yes.
that's something I really love for clinicians in particular to understand, that when we treat it that way, it usually ends up a little bit better for our clients.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Again, what I'm appreciating about everything you're saying, and I think you even said this, is like you're helping them reorient to how they relate to themselves. All of
Mhm.
these pieces, like it's all this. And I also appreciate that you named, like, we're not looking to resolve every single little individual paper cut,
Yeah.
but it's like shifting how they're relating to themselves helps ease all of that and address all of
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
which seems like a much more effective way to work anyway. And maybe the road won't feel quite so long if we're just
Yeah.
helping them reorient to how they're
Yeah.
relating to themselves to begin with.
Yeah. And I have so many clients, and going back to the idea of like starting slow and then being able to move faster,
Yeah.
where it's like, something would come up, they're dealing with something or whatever. And it takes a very long time to navigate through that and to understand the impact or how to deal with the triggers or set boundaries or whatever. And it's like, oh my gosh, is this what I'm going to have to do for the rest of my life? Everything is going to
Hmm.
be this way. And usually for a period of time, it is that way. It is so overwhelming because, again, we're
Yeah.
reorienting to all of life. But then those same clients, as they have diligently navigated things through, all of a sudden they're dealing with the everyday stuff of life, or even like really big stuff. And they're like, whoa, I'm like kind of killing it. Like I'm
Yeah.
doing a really good job. And I
Yeah.
love those stories because it's like, yeah, you have gotten yourself here. You have really created the space and the capacity and the safety inside of yourself to be able to handle this. And yes, we might still wish that it could have happened 20, 30, 40 years ago, but you're doing it now, and it's shifted the way then that you're living life. And it's not that you're never triggered, and it's not that all your relationships are easy and breezy, but you now have these internal skills and capacity to be able to navigate them in a different way. It does happen.
Mm. I just am really appreciating. I imagine there will be folks listening to this that what you just said is really hope giving.
Yeah.
At least it is for me as I'm thinking
Mm,
about, people in my life who I know, different backgrounds, lots of different experiences, but this idea of like this work, like it's real.
yeah.
You're not just showing up and it's like, I don't know. It's like you're
Mhm.
actually helping them again reorient in the world, relate to themselves differently, relate to their experiences differently.
Mhm.
And that just feels really hopeful to me. So yeah,
Yeah,
thank
thank
you.
you. Yeah, I'll share a little experience. This
Please.
was years ago. I had been doing a lot of work with like anxious attachment and relationships and things like that. And I had a very clear, what I think is a very clear pattern of like how I would react to, fear of abandonment or
Yeah.
sensing disconnection or things like that. And I'd been working so hard, and I was in some situation, and I can't even tell you the exact situation that I was in, but it was something with like a lapse in communication or a miscommunication or something like that. And I remember I was standing in my living room, and I was like, this is the point where I would normally spiral
I
into
love that.
like anxiety and dissolve in shame. And I'm not doing that. Like, oh, this is what it's like to actually live as a healing
Yeah.
person. And I was like, okay, okay, this actually works, you know? And so,
Yeah.
and
I
there are
love
still,
those moments. I
there's
love those
moments,
moments.
yeah,
And I've had clients like describe kind of a similar,
yeah,
like I had this choice point
mhm,
for the first time. I could
yep,
actually kind of give myself a little bit of space to be
mhm,
like, normally I know I would have done this, but I feel like this whole other option is available to me now that
yes,
I
yeah,
wasn't open. It
yes,
wasn't available to me before. And
yes,
that's what you're helping create is like this
mhm.
spaciousness for them.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
So
a
cool.
really, I love when clients come back and tell me that. I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, that is so cool. You have no idea how big that is.
It's
Like, it's
huge.
huge.
So cool.
Yeah. Hmm.
Oh, I love it. Laura, I feel like I could talk to you all day. And
Thank you.
there's more questions we didn't get to. So maybe at some point we'll have you back
Yeah, for
if you'd like. But
sure.
I feel like there's just so much work that you've been doing in the space. Again,
Hmm.
I appreciate the way that you're bringing these concepts, the way you're talking about them. It feels trauma informed, obviously, the way that you're talking about them, because what's interesting, kind of like I said earlier, is like some of the ways that this has been brought forward into it doesn't feel trauma informed, which is ironic.
Right.
But
Yeah.
the way you're talking about it, holding these concepts, the content that I know you're sharing, and also, so I just would like to invite you to share a little bit about what you have out there in the world. But the way you're doing it is just so aligned with my heart, and I'm really appreciating that. So, can you share with listeners where they might find you, find your work?
Yeah. So I'm on social media. That's usually the best way to connect with me if you just want like to see what I'm all about, and it's free, it's easy.
Yeah.
I'm on every platform, Dr. Laura E. Anderson. That's also my website, drlauraeanderson.com. I have all sorts of things, whether it's, therapy, coaching, consulting. I'm I just opened up a training program for other clinicians, practitioners, things like that, to be working with religious trauma. I'm an author. I have a book, When Religion Hurts You, which is available wherever you purchase books. I also am the owner, CEO of the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery, which is an online trauma coaching company. There's a variety of reasons we've gone the coaching route. One of them is the wellness model and really looking at the biopsychosocial, the whole person, rather than
Mm-hmm.
the medical model, which unfortunately therapy still is
Falls in there.
highly connected with, right? But all of the practitioners there, usually they have both academic backgrounds in mental health fields as well as advanced trauma training, but they also have their own experiences of having grown up or being a part of these environments. And so it's this really nice, like, melding together of personal and professional, where we started a baseline of believing you. It was that bad. You do not have to convince us. And you also probably don't have to explain it to us because we kind of know what's going on. And so it's like it saves the first, 5-6 months of like
Mm-hmm.
a therapeutic or practitioner relationship to be able to start on that baseline. And then we work with clients usually through very somatic based, lenses and things like that. Although we take a very whole body, top down and bottom up approach, because that's what complex trauma deserves. Yeah. And so we are the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery. You can find us. Our website is traumaresolutionandrecovery.com. That's also where we are at Trauma Resolution and Recovery on social media. And I think those are all the places you can find me. I'm sure
Okay.
you can just Google me too. And
Cool.
I've come up probably in a lot of different places. Who knows?
I love
Yeah.
it. And if they don't remember all of that, they can remember where to find you on social media. And I'm sure you
Yes.
have links to all the other things
All
too
of it.
from there. So that's a great
All of
hub.
it. Yes. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Laura, thank you so much for joining us and taking the time. I know your schedule's
Yeah.
busy, so we really appreciate you taking the time and just sharing with us a bit of what you've experienced and what's been helpful to you.
Yeah, well, it's been awesome to be a part of this. I will come back anytime. This is a
Awesome.
lovely conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. You can also connect with us in other ways. We are on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. As a mental health professional, your commitment to healing and growth inspires us. We at the Complex Trauma Training Center are committed to supporting you in your well-being and success. That's why we are honored to invite you to our Space Program 2026, an interdevelopment program of support and self-discovery for therapists on the personal, interpersonal, and transpersonal levels. Running over 6 online sessions in 2026, this interactive experiential learning program is designed to support self-care and self-discovery for therapists exploring internally, relationally, and transpersonally. CTTC faculty will welcome you into a professional community of therapists that are seeking to create greater effectiveness and resilience in our professional lives. As CTTC faculty Brad Kammer says, the intent is that this program will help us not only become more effective therapists, but also love our work more. Please visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com and secure your spot in the 2026 SPACE program. Thanks to Rig for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.